uh, Dr. Rollie Lal, and dear participants, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to NICE webinar on COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and the Undoing of Human Rights in Counterterrorism. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. To talk on the very interesting topic of today, we have distinguished scholar from the United States, Dr. Rollie Lal. Dr. Rollie Lal is an associate professor at Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University, where she teaches graduate courses on transnational security, foreign policy, and international political economy. Her research focuses on organized crime, terrorism, religious extremism, energy, China, South Asia, and other areas. Previously, Dr. Lal was associate professor at the United States Department of State's Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies. Dr. Lal has also served as assistant professor at the Vlerick Leuven Grant Management School in Gent, Belgium, and St. Petersburg, Russia, where she taught MBA courses on international business management and risk analysis. From 2002 to 2006, Dr. Lal was political scientist at RAND, where she performed research and analysis on a wide spectrum of economic and security issues. She is the author of several books, including Terrorist Criminal Enterprise, Understanding China and India, Central Asia and its Asian neighbors, Iran's political demographic and economic vulnerabilities, and the Muslim world after 9/11. She was correspondent for the Japanese newspaper, the Yomiuri Shimbun, in the 1990s, and has published articles in other newspapers, including the Financial Times, the New York Times, and others. Dr. Lal received her Ph.D. in International Relations and her Master's in Strategic Studies and International Economics from the Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and her BA in Economics from the University of Maryland at College Park. May I request Dr. Lal to make her presentation in about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. We request our participants to drop their questions in the Zoom chat box or comment below the Facebook Live. Dr. Lal, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I just wanted to start off by saying I really appreciate Dr. Jaiswal for inviting me. And also, I just wanted to mention how impressed I am with the think tank, with your think tank in Nepal, and how you've been able to get together such a wonderful set of speakers, especially in this time of crisis. So it's really impressive, and I hope people attend more of your talks that you've been going on and check out your library of videos. I think we've got a couple people with their audio on. You might want to put on mute. Okay, so I want to start off by saying that to understand how the US is currently damaging international human rights standards, we could technically go very far back in history, but I'm going to keep it short. And so I'm going to look more closely at how the pandemic evolved and how that has fed into the Black Lives Matter movement. And then really what was the US government's damaging response and what has been that impact. So what we're seeing right now overall is that the Trump administration is weakening global human rights in two main ways. The first is that the US treatment of poor and Black workers in response to COVID-19. And the second is the attempts to stifle the Black Lives Matter protests in a very harsh and authoritarian manner. And both of these moves have had implications for the international human rights agenda. So first off, when the pandemic spread into the US, the first things that we really noticed were the closed shops and the unemployment. These were the first signs for most people ahead of people actually getting ill. So most people didn't have direct contact with the disease. And so at the very first, the country was quite unified. And you could see, similar to Italy, people singing songs in New York and on balconies, and everyone was very horrified at the fact that we didn't have enough protective equipment. You see in hospitals the use of plastic bags, people don't have enough masks to use in the hospital. And there was a lot of unification of the country along all ethnicities about the horror of this pandemic. But what we see very quickly, by April 7th, the reports are showing that Blacks as a group inside the US are disproportionately impacted. The research was showing that they had less access to healthcare. They had more underlying conditions such as diabetes, blood pressure, and so forth. They were living in more high population density areas, for example, in urban areas with apartment buildings where you have to crowd into an elevator, or in more high population density areas where you have to go out shopping and run into a lot of people. They also had jobs that could not easily go remote. They're necessary workers in delivery, in shops, in hospitals, and so forth. Whereas white people overall were able more easily to socially isolate. You have people who are advantaged, like myself, who are sitting here in front of a computer, who were able to continue their job from home very safely. So we could see the disparity in the factors that could cause the Black population to be more heavily impacted. And what we saw was that the data revealed Black Americans 3 times more likely to die from COVID than whites. That's huge. It's a major difference in both how often they were contracting the disease and how often they're dying from the disease. And what we see is that after that, the focus suddenly withered from the US government in particular. President Trump stopped making virus briefings, his public briefings on television, by April 27. He said that everything was getting better, and he refocused the national message onto the economy. He also very clearly did not wear a mask, and he started to mock other people who do. His right-wing supporters did not really want to support did not want to restrict their freedoms just because non-white people were dying. So this was a very critical moment in April, between April 7 and April 27, where you see that Blacks are impacted, and then the policies and the actions that start to change just within a few weeks. And then very clearly, the next decision set started out against Black and poor workers, brown workers. And that was when the meat processing plants were hit. In South Dakota, where there is a major Smithfield meat processing plant, there were over 850 cases. And what we saw was that mainly Blacks and Latinos and immigrants were working there. Some governors, for example, in Wisconsin, we even saw, not governor, sorry, the court justice in Wisconsin mentioned that when they were confronted with the fact there were so many people hit by the pandemic, they said, oh, well, this was due to the meat packing. It wasn't just the regular folks in Brown County. And that was a way of highlighting that Black, brown, and immigrant people were not the regular folks of Wisconsin or Brown County. And so we see this kind of government response that reveals these underlying racist concepts. Trump then decides to invoke the Defense Production Act on April 28th to make sure that these meat processing plants stay open. The corporations that were running these meat processing plants were then protected by the Defense Production Act. They were protected from paying unemployment and from being liable or being sued by workers who contracted disease. On the other hand, the meat packers themselves, the workers, were forced to return to work in cramped conditions. If they decided that it was too unsafe for them to go to work for themselves, too risky for their own family to go to work, they would not get any benefits. So this was a policy that was very clearly and in your face stacked against Blacks, browns, and poors. And this was poor people. And this was really the first major strike against the human rights of this entire population. So by the time George Floyd's murder was broadcast in May, as you all know, he was a Black man who was murdered by police, a policeman who placed his knee on his neck for 9 minutes. by the time this happened, and it was broadcast live, not on people's phones, people were at home, they were watching. And people were already primed for this situation. And Black people realized that the government was not protecting them. You then also have a variety of other events. A young lady, Breonna Taylor, and other killings of Black people just added to the outrage. And you see this outpouring of grief, of anger, of something needs to be done. The fact that people were quarantined at home actually did have an effect in the sense that people were able to protest. People were did not have to go to their job. So you have a much larger group of the population who are out on the streets. You have these Black Lives Matter protests that are across society, growing in many cities. You see it growing in Los Angeles, Atlanta, New York, and so forth. So you see this really broad support for the protests. Then what you have is that President Trump took this to another level. In his second major move to weaken human rights, Trump responded to these protests rather than by saying, okay, these are some valid demands, let's talk about this. Let's maybe get together some people and discuss our next moves. He responded to the protests with authoritarian words and violence. He said right at the outset, he said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. It's a phrase from the 1960s that glorified violence, and it really caused people, it really did not help the situation at all. On top of that, even though there was very little violence at the protests, he sent in the National Guard, he sent in militarized police, and he very much supported governors and mayors who did so. In addition to that, we see a lot of attacks at this time on journalists and protesters, taking them to prison because of the fact that many cities had instituted curfews. There was the ability of police to just massively grab protesters who are simply walking in the streets and say, okay, you violated curfew, you're here, even for no reason whatsoever, just grabbing protesters and imprisoning them. Fortunately, there were some journalists, for example, from CNN who were caught, the police were caught live incarcerating and putting them in handcuffs. And this really brought attention to the fact that people who were doing nothing illegal were being caught up by law enforcement in this process. And it was a real disregard for civil rights. So in the next round, I will call it, against human rights, President Trump then designated the protesters as terrorists. So this is actually, first he basically says, okay, we're going to crack down on these protesters as looters. And then he changed the narrative. So there's a fundamental shift in the narrative from, oh, these are thugs and looters, to, oh, these protesters are actually terrorists. They are against the state. This is a very fundamental difference, and yet it's something that a lot of people, a lot of citizens let go by without noticing. You say, oh, okay, well, thugs, terrorists, what's the difference? But there is a very big difference in terms of how the government can perceive this and what it means for counterterrorism policy. So what we were seeing is that even though in these protests, in many instances, we saw that white supremacists were causing violence on purpose in order to kind of cause trouble for the movement. You also did have some looting and violence from the protesters, because there is always that part of society. So you do have very small pockets of violence from the extreme right and the extreme left. However, Trump blamed the extreme left. He called them Antifa. He gave them a word, Antifa, which is a shortened term meaning anti-fascist, which was quite absurd because, of course, many of his own policies were fascist. And so what we see is that he calls this group Antifa, and then he says, you know, Antifas are terrorists, even though we know in the US that there is no organized group that is actually Antifa. There is no anti-fascist group. It is, the protesters were a inchoate and just, it was a groundswell movement. However, President Trump created this concept of a group in order to create an enemy of his opposition. So it is the creation inside of this political process of an enemy that is inside the domestic space, the domestic political space. Basically, President Trump was building an extrajudicial process to criminalize normal civilians. That is to say, he's going outside of the legal system to say normal civilians who are protesting are criminals. They are terrorists. Because you see, the problem is fundamentally, the president cannot label a domestic group as a terrorist group under US law. It is not possible. Nonetheless, he activated the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force to target Antifa protesters. And in yet another absurd moment, Trump called in the National Guard and the police to use pepper spray and rubber bullets in front of the White House on June 1st to clear the park so that he and a group of his supporters could take a walk to the church and have a photo opportunity with a Bible, holding a Bible in his hand. It was very absurd to do a crackdown on civil protests on your way to church, and that was noted by many church representatives. But what you see at the same time as all of this is that the protests were inspiring people around the world, and that was very positive. We see these protests spreading to London, Seoul, Paris, Australia, Nairobi, and just cities all over the world. In addition to that, we were seeing in small towns of the US. It was really spreading everywhere. So you have this inspirational impact of the movement around the world to rise against racism. And so in many ways, the US was taking a leadership role and is taking a leadership role in demanding human rights. However, this was led by the people, not the government. So where the government could have taken the mantle and said, you know what, these people are right. We need to stand against racism. We need to stand for human rights around the world. And this is what we in the US are doing for it. And we really recommend all of our allies and other countries do the same. That would have been a clever and leading maneuver by the Trump administration, by the US government. And in many ways, the US embassies took it upon themselves to try to do that. The US embassies kind of almost independently, you see around the world, unfurling flags for Black Lives Matter and showing support for this movement. So you see almost a schism, a split inside the US government where you do have people inside the government saying, you know, we understand and we believe in these human rights and we support this movement. And you have the Trump administration, which is a group on its own, sort of taking on the opposite, saying, you know what, you don't hear the word human rights being said by the Trump administration in this context. So what we do know is that the Trump administration's response to these protests did lower the bar for human rights abusers. He very forthrightly told the governors, look, he says, you've got to arrest people. You've got to track people. You have to put them in jail for 10 years and you'll never see this stuff again. So that was his recommendation. Then you have the former National Security Advisor, Bolton, he's issuing a new book saying that Trump had told Xi to repress the Uyghurs in China, build camps for them, that Trump was in favor of this type of behavior, because Trump does support counterterrorism against Muslims, both in the US and abroad, but he doesn't care who they are. He doesn't care if they're actually terrorists or not terrorists, and this is part of the problem. So what we saw was that the US harsh response to civil protest has prepared the ground for the suppression of minorities and for misuse under the guise of counterterrorism. And this weakens our ability to respond to actual terrorism. So, for example, what we saw in China right away after these protests and after these crackdowns on the protests was that when the US attempted to criticize China for their crackdowns on the protests in Hong Kong, it led to a response from the foreign ministry spokesperson of China. The foreign ministry spokesperson tweeted in basically Trump language. She tweeted, "I can't breathe," which was a reference to some of the last words of George Floyd. And basically it was a reference to, hey, you know, how dare you speak to us about Hong Kong and our protests when you cannot manage your own. You cannot uphold human rights inside your own country. You don't have a voice to speak to us on this issue. And that was very sharp. I mean, it came back very fast at us. It also has allowed China to claim a conspiracy theory. So now we're kind of in a war of conspiracy theories between the US and China. And this one was that the Chinese were saying, well, you know what? If the US doesn't care about human rights at home, that means that actually when we are criticizing them, it is for political motives. We don't have, the criticism from China was that we don't fundamentally care about human rights. It's just a hammer that we use to move forward our political agenda. And so therefore, we don't really care about Uyghurs in China. We don't really care about Hong Kong. We're just saying that because we want to keep China in its place. And that allows them to take the criticism of their human rights abuses, China's human rights abuses, take that criticism and say, you know what, we're not listening because this is not really a human rights criticism. It's just, you know, your attempt to hammer us and keep us down. I think that's a very damaging conspiracy theory. It's a very damaging conceptual space to be working in. And we don't really want to move the debate in that direction. We also see the Chinese claiming in their media that what this is an example of is the fact that free markets, democracy, and civil liberties fail. That the US claimed that we won the Cold War and that we have free markets and civil liberties and democracy, and it's great, and everyone else should have them. But China says, you know what? Look at that. You know, your system is failing. You have protests. You can't even manage your protests. You have huge human rights problems. You say that democracy and civil liberties protections are going to protect human rights, but they don't. That is the claim on the Chinese side. So then the Chinese say, well, you know what? We don't need them. China's system is better. And that is an argument they are trying to use domestically to you know, uphold the system, uphold the Chinese system of authoritarianism, which is again ironic. So we are seeing that in our relations with China alone, you can see a variety of arenas where human rights are being eroded very significantly. And our ability to impact their actions on human rights is being eroded. And then when we look at other countries, for example, Iran in response to all these protests and the crackdown said, well, you know, the EU is blind to Western human rights. The EU doesn't criticize other Western countries like the US. They only hammer non-Western countries like us. So the Iranians say, well, basically, you know, again, this is hypocritical. You don't look at yourselves in the West. You only like to hammer the rest of us. And fascinatingly, when you look at Russia and Russia's response to this, rather than criticize the US, the Russians kind of took it as an example. What you see in Russia is the government and government-supported media showing clips on TV and media of the chaos, of the US chaos, the police response. And the commentary is that, you know what, this is an example. This is an example of what happens when the police and the government are weak. When the police and the government are weak and don't crack down enough, and you don't have enough authoritarianism, you're going to get chaos. So the Russian perspective on this is, let's show this chaos and say we need more police brutality. So whether you're looking at it from the Chinese perspective, the Iranian perspective, or the Russian perspective, the new narrative is that they're using this set of protests and then the response to the protest as a way of denigrating the US and EU and global support for human rights standards. Now in South Asia, it is fascinating the way that it could have an impact. Trump's human rights example is, I would say, particularly damaging in South Asia through Hindu nationalism, which is basically the Indian version of Trumpism. It is, in the US, Trumpism is basically a type of white nationalism, and in India it is a Hindu nationalism. And the BJP's Hindu national agenda is both anti-Muslim and racist, fundamentally. Now, the Indian government, the way that you can see this a bit more clearly is that the Indian government also looks the other way when mobs of Hindu nationalists kill Muslims or lower caste individuals for being in the beef and leather businesses or dealing in the cow trade. You see this rise in the last few years of cow vigilantism and cow lynchings, not that they're lynching the cows, but lynching of the people who are involved with this type of cow business. Inside India, the narrative is that when a Muslim kills a Hindu, it is terrorism. And this is the same in the US. When a Muslim kills an American, it's terrorism. But when a Hindu nationalist kills a lower caste person or a Muslim, it's a hate crime. And this is something we see in the US too. In the US, you know, when a white person kills a group of black people at a church or somewhere, he was mentally disturbed. He just didn't like them. Or what other reason can we think of? So you see this disparity in narratives about who is a terrorist and who is a disaffected individual who just their emotions took over them. And this is a narrative that governments have to be very careful about using the law to support a balanced and egalitarian narrative rather than one that is based in racism or some type of a religious-based rights. So what you can see is that racism and casteism are actually extremely similar. And one of the main reasons is that caste and race both place humans in a hierarchy from birth. It is not something that you can, you know, convert out of. And so there is a fundamental connection between both of these concepts, but the Indian government would never really want race and caste to be connected. And of course, the Trump administration would never go there because it's quite a good relationship between the two governments. Now, I want to also mention that another aspect to the issue of US foreign policy and human rights. US foreign policy has damaged human rights even before our hypocrisy on Black Lives Matter protests. In many ways, the US needs to do more introspection in our foreign policy as a whole, in our national security policy, international interest policy. Because what you can see if you look closely at our policies is that white supremacy, racism, and sexism are so entrenched in our own governing systems inside of our policymaking process that the US government has difficulty seeing the human rights problems and inconsistencies in our foreign policy. For example, we often ignore how a military intervention kills many brown people in pursuit of democracy and human rights. I can just give a few examples, but you can fill in the list yourself. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, the list could go on. The US believes that it has a colorblind foreign policy, but fundamentally, the lack of Black Americans in the foreign policy space is damaging our ability to have insight and empathy for other races. And it's damaging our ability to support human rights in that context. In order to change these types of policies externally, you cannot separate out foreign policy from domestic policy and say these are two completely different worlds. We will deal with our race problem someday, and we will deal with our foreign policy separately. Foreign policy has nothing to do with it. This is untrue and naive. When you look historically, you can see that during the Black Civil Rights Movement, both Martin Luther King Jr. And many others were against the war in Vietnam for this reason. They said, why would you send a group of Black people who have not yet attained their human rights in this country to go to another country and kill brown people in supposed support of their rights, which doesn't make any sense. So Martin Luther King Jr. himself made clear that the Vietnam War was not a human rights-based war, and that it was not something that he and many other Black Americans would support. But in many ways, the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, that's another complex topic that I think is worth investigation, because I do think that having Black Americans, having not just Black Americans, brown Americans, women, having each of these groups inside our national security apparatus, inside of our foreign policy apparatus, has a fundamental effect on decision-making, on creating the policies, on critiquing the policies that we make and saying, hey, maybe we can look at this from a different perspective. So in terms of recommendations, I would say that the US definitely needs to fix its approach. Now, we know already, we don't want to be naive about this, we know that the Trump administration will not fix it. And so in many ways, the rest of the government must. We know that the US Congress and the state governments need to take on moves to support workers' rights, support unemployment benefits, provide more access to health resources. During this pandemic, it has been highlighted the fact that we do not have some type of universal health care or reasonably priced health care to support Black Americans and other poor Americans. The US government, the Congress, and the states also need to fight police brutality and support the Black protester concerns. Look at them very closely, come up with practical and doable reforms, things that can be done quickly, that can help support human rights. We also need to reject the use of militarized force against protesters. There's no need for that level of weaponry against civil protesters. The US also needs to uphold human rights globally. It needs to say, look, we are looking internally, we are looking externally. We are going to uphold these human rights around the world and at home. And if we don't do this, we do risk the erosion of the standards we have fought for decades. And lastly, I do believe very strongly that we really need to increase the number of Black Americans and women in national security decision-making and foreign policy making in order to improve our record on human rights and policy making. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Jaiswal so we can go for some Q&A.
Thank you very much. It was a really wonderful presentation. We have got lots of questions, so I'm not going to summarize. I directly jump to the questions because it is, how would you like to take one by one or maybe in a set of three?
One by one is better, otherwise it's confusing.
So the first question is, how do you see the contribution of bell hooks in the upliftment of Black women in America? How does the intersectionality of race, gender, and class work in America?
I think it's a great question. Bell Hooks was a great feminist Black thinker, and she really brought to the fore the fact that we need to look at both women's rights and race at the same time, because what had happened and what has happened historically is that women end up sort of having to ignore women's rights in order to move forward the race agenda for example, civil rights and so forth. So I think that she made a very good case for the fact that we need to look at both, and that feminists need to not just focus on white women, but need to focus on white and Black and brown women. And the fact that the civil rights movement also needs to incorporate the female perspective very strongly. If you don't have rights for women, I mean, right now, for example, in the pandemic, women have been very disproportionately affected. You have the fact that, you know, when children are not in school, the women have taken the bulk of staying home to watch the children so that the man could go to work. And this is important, understanding how policy and how governments can help support women to make sure that they can continue their progress in employment, in healthcare, in whatever needs that they have to support their families. So I think that Bell Hooks was a great leader in this.
Let's move to second question. Whether it is the issue of healthcare or gun control or Planned Parenthood or LGBT issues, the US federal system has been instrumental lens to analyze the challenges of arriving at any sort of legislation. What, accordingly, does the COVID-19 experience tell about the nature of relationship between state and federal government in the United States?
Could you say that last part one more time? What does the COVID-19 say about?
It's about the nature of relationship between state and the federal government.
Oh, the nature of state and the federal government. Oh, okay. I think that some of the things that we have definitely seen during this COVID crisis is that the federal government was much less powerful than we expected. You know, when we look at what our expectations were for what the government would do in a pandemic, you can look at popular culture. You look at the movies like, you know, Contagion, or, you know, the TV shows like Walking Dead, and you see that, you know, the government suddenly mobilizes and the federal government sends the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and they manage everything very quickly. But when reality hit and the pandemic hit, it was not the federal government that really took control. There was not enough medical supplies. The states had to fight for their own. And so we saw that the states and the governors were far more powerful when it came to health issues and workers' issues. And in many ways, it means that, number one, we need to either support the states more, or number two, the federal government needs to take a little more responsibility, because it was very chaotic, the US response to the pandemic, as you can see from our very large caseload right now.
The third question is, how would you look at the racial discrimination in Asian perspective? I think you briefly have touched on this, but maybe you'd like to respond.
The racial issue in the Asian perspective. I think that, you know, it's an interesting question. I did touch upon it a little bit, but I would like to say something else, which is that, you know, Asian countries are not generally considered immigrant countries. Most countries around the world, not just Asia, but most countries are ethnically constructed. So China, for example, they think, okay, we're Chinese. Japan is Japanese, and Korea, and Indians say, well, we're Indians. So when you have an ethnic construction of a nation, then you are in many ways saying, this is the identity of our country. Now, when it comes to China, originally they said, you know, this is a communist country. In a communist country, the commonality should be equality under communism. But in actuality, what has happened in China is that it is largely a Han ethnic nation. And that is why China has so many problems with integrating the Tibetans and the Uyghurs into their concept of the state, into their concept of the nation. Because if you ask a typical Chinese person, they will say, no, no, we are a Han nation. And this is based on some research I did for my book on understanding China and India. Now in India, you had people back then who would say that, no, India is a multi-ethnic nation and all that. But the fact of the matter is that is in decline. Now more Indians would say, I think, oh, it's more of a Hindu nation. The problem with an ethnic construction of nationality is that it is fundamentally racist. There's no way out. You know, I mean, if you're going to say, well, you know, we are all this ethnicity, then what do you do with these random other people from, you know, Korea or Uganda who just showed up in your country? You know, how do you suddenly make these two things match? So the fundamental problem that Asians have is that in supporting ethnic identity as the foremost is that how do you then keep racism at bay, as long as you think that my race has to be pure. And intermarriage is one of those issues underlying in there. You know, can Indians, can Chinese, can Koreans marry a white person, a black person, a Spanish person, a whatever person, you know? And when you see the discussion that happens around intermarriage, forget about intercaste, you know, or interreligion. Whenever you look at these discussions and the debate around intermarriage, that is what really reveals people's beliefs when it comes to race. And I think that needs to be deconstructed, that needs to be worn down so that people understand everybody's equal and there is no hierarchy actually.
Other question is like, people are comparing the black lives with white death. How different is white lives with black in United States?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but how different are white?
Black from white in United States.
Oh, how different are black and white? Well, I mean, you know, everybody is an American in the US, so it's not a citizenship thing, but what we generally see in the US is that even though supposedly everyone has the same rights, technically blacks are faced with many disadvantages that they have inherited from a history of slavery, a history of very significant racism, and an inability to access financial resources. This is a huge one. So there are two, I would say, a couple of different, there are so many issues here, but I'm going to try to boil it down a bit. But after slavery, blacks did not have land. They didn't have property. And upon after the Civil War, blacks at first were told, hey, you know, you're going to get 40 acres and a mule. We're going to give you something so you can start out your life. But then white people said, no, 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 actually, we were just, you know, we're not really going to do that. Instead, the white slave owners who had to lose their slaves were given compensation for the fact that they had lost their property, because these people were considered property. But what you can see is at that time, so you're talking the end of the 1800s, you see already the disparity in economic basis, right? So you have blacks who are now starting off with zero education because they were not allowed to be educated during slavery, and whites who have now been, many of them compensated and first have already made money off of, you know, slaves who were picking their crops and whatnot. So you already have a huge disparity, and this is a long time ago. When you start going into the 1900s, you see that this continues because, you know, blacks are not going to any good schools even after they're allowed to, and whites have advantages in buying houses, getting loans, mortgages, financing. Blacks are blocked from this. You have a lot of policies that redline blacks. That means that you couldn't have blacks living in the same neighborhoods as white people. So and it wasn't until 1954 that blacks were even supposed to go to school together with white people. So there are a lot of very severe historical disadvantages against Black people that really make it hard to just suddenly say, okay, well, everything's fine now, so why aren't Blacks doing better? I mean, definitely there's something to be said for finding ways inside our society, inside American society, that can help bring this into a better balance so that Blacks can have the same type of opportunities that whites have enjoyed for a very long time. And that's a very basic answer, but we'll just go with that.
From the discussion, it seems there are lots of similarities between Blacks in the United States and minorities in India. While women remain excluded in both the countries from the decision-making desk, how will you see class and gender dimensions cutting across each other?
Yes, also a very good question. Yeah, class, gender, race, these are actually very big similarities between the US minorities and India. In fact, I would say that the intersection of race and gender in particular is very strong in both countries. Now, in Black America, you will see that Black women are a double minority. You know, they are a minority by being Black, and then in addition to that, within the Black community, they often feel that they're discriminated by men or suppressed in many ways by their community. The Black women have also a very particularly bad historical moment. I mean, both do in their own way, but during slavery, Black women were sexually abused, raped continuously by their owners, by the slave owners. They were not allowed to stay together with their family. Their children were taken away from them. I mean, it is absolutely horrifying when you look at the situation of what Black women have had to deal with. Now, having said that, now obviously that doesn't happen, but to deal with that trauma of your entire community is quite difficult. Now, today, what you'll see is that in terms of sex trafficking in the US and human trafficking, Black women are again much more susceptible. And that is still inside our legal system in many ways connected to the historical instances of rape. So you see that criminal penalties for men who rape Black women or use a Black child prostitute, the criminal penalties are very low. And that's because of prejudice inside the system. Now, moving to the Indian system, I would say that in many ways, it's also very, very unequal, and it's just different. Again, women have for a long time not had a very strong voice in who they want to marry. You have a lot of forced marriages, you have a lot of child marriages. And so this inequality that is built into society needs to be discussed. I mean, why is it that in India you have a very large number of rapes? You know, why is it that a woman cannot safely ride the bus? You know, so these are issues that need to be taken up not just by women. In order for this to be changed, you need women, you need mothers to change culturally what they're thinking about this. You need men to change their expectations of what their wife and daughter are doing, and that is in India or in the US. It's very important that we look at how our cultural expectations of women need to change in order for society to move forward with human rights.
Next question is, do you think human rights is a geopolitical tool? Because since most of the countries do not agree with China, they tend to raise each and every issue of China. However, ignore human rights violation in India or India ignoring other partner countries. There is massive human rights violation against Muslims in different parts of the world, but the whole world is only talking about Xinjiang, Tibet, and not Syria.
And not Syria.
Not Syria. Yeah, not in other countries.
Yes, I agree. I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of the question. What is the question, part of the question?
Like, do you think human rights is a geopolitical tool?
Oh, is it a geopolitical tool? Yes. No, I don't actually think that human rights are a geopolitical tool. I do think that it's sometimes used as such, but I do think that there is a broad support around the world and in the United Nations for basic human rights in all countries, for women, for all races, for all religions. So I do think that it is a valid and important construct that we need to support. And that's why I wanted to discuss this today, actually, because I do think that human rights is something that we need to support. Now, having said that, do countries abuse it as a concept? Yes, I do think so. I do think, and this is part of the problem with foreign policy of many countries, is that both, when we talk about Syria, both the US and Russia claim to be supporting human rights, right? So the US says, well, you know, Assad is evil and he killed a lot of people and he used chemical weapons. So we need to support human rights. So we're going to intervene. And the Russians say, no, 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 you know, Assad is the only one that can protect against Islamic State. So you need to support him because that is the only way to support human rights. So there are many different ways of looking at this. And it's very unfortunate that major countries make little countries like Syria the playground for that battle. But I do think that one of the problems that many countries do not see is that we do need to take an approach of how many people are going to die in our intervention. When we decide to do supposed humanitarian intervention to protect people's human rights, we need to make sure that we are not killing more people than we are trying to save, you know? And I think that this is a calculation that is not taken very seriously at all. It's more what usually happens in the politicization of this debate is that, oh, you know, 10,000 people died, but we're going to call them terrorists. And this is the problem with not clarifying in the counterterrorism debate who are civilians, what are human rights, and how are we going to apply these issues properly. So I do think that, yes, they are abused, and this is the responsibility of people inside societies to call the government out. And this is why I do think that we need to have a broader base of people in decision-making so they can call out the government and say, you know what, bombing Syria is not a good idea. I don't think it was a good idea. We killed far too many people. And too many civilians died and too much destruction occurred so that civilians have to, in many ways, turn to militant groups in order for them to find water and food and protection. And so the US and other countries should think, you know, when we do a military intervention, if we destroy a society to a certain extent, we are inviting in terrorist groups, we are inviting in organized crime to take that space that has been left free by the government that we destroyed. And there is not enough recognition of that.
In the context of death of George Floyd and the widespread protest, can you throw some light on the state of incarceration of Black people in the US?
Okay, on the state of incarceration of Black people. Yes, it's a very bad situation. So part of this is that when the US started its war against drugs in the 1970s, that was the start of a very large drive to incarcerate Black people because basically we were able to pick up a lot of Black people on minimal drug charges and incarcerate them. So you have an extremely large percentage of Black men in prison relative to the percent of white people in prison. And this is very destructive to society. It's destructive to their abilities to take on a job, to vote, it's and to maintain your family life. So it has a problem of destroying Black society from its fundamentals. So when we look at the incarceration of Black people, we need to really rethink. We need to think, okay, who is it that is really too dangerous to have in society? If there's a violent individual who is murdering and raping people, then yes, they need to be incarcerated. We need to remove them from society and allow society to continue. However, if you have someone that you know, smoked a joint of marijuana or in some other way used some small amount of drugs, it's really something that needs to go to social or health services. Why is this person involved in drugs? Now, if it is a drug trafficker, someone who's pushing it and killing people, to push drugs. Now that's a different category. So we need to be more clear, but just randomly incarcerating lots and lots of Black people is not going to help the situation. In fact, it slows down GDP growth in the US. But I do think that there is a more fundamental issue here, and that is that, frankly, after the Civil War, after the freedom of the slaves, in many ways, systemically, I do believe that white people have preferred to generally mass incarcerate Blacks to keep them in some ways out of the way. And I think that we need to think very deeply and philosophically about that. You know, why is this a comfortable, why has this been a comfortable place for policymakers to be in? Why are they comfortable having that many people in prison? And how has prison privatization helped make the situation worse? So prison reform, judicial reform, police reform, there are a lot of reforms that are in our future.
Next question is, many people in India have equated the discrimination faced by the Muslim community in India to the oppression faced by Afro-American in US. Can there be correlation between these two issues, and if yes, then on what terms?
Okay. Yes, I do think that, so the discrimination faced by the Muslim community in India and the oppression faced by African Americans in the US. Yes, I do think that there can be a correlation. This just has to do with discrimination of minority groups. And again, I'm going to bring it back to the idea of dominant culture and identity, and the fact that countries cannot safely construct the national identity around race or around religion. It's just not safe. If you decide that the whole country should be determined to be white nationalist, or that it should be Hindu nationalist, then everyone else is not safe by definition. So technically, there's a fundamental problem here. You need to look at how you can set up the laws of a country to be race-free and religion-free. Now, I know in India this is complex because you do have a separate set of family laws that govern Muslims inside India. Now, having said that, you know, there are things that get much more complex very quickly because you do have a minority inside a minority. Now, inside India, you do have Muslim women. Now, Muslim women are doubly oppressed inside India. And as you all in South Asia know, the Shah Bano case was very enlightening in seeing that a Muslim woman was not able to uphold her civil rights in the context of being a Muslim inside India, because the Muslim rights were supported ahead of hers. So she wasn't able to get her rights as a divorced woman. Now, you know, governments need to decide whose rights are they going to protect. And I really do think that governments need to start thinking in terms of protecting the rights of the least protected. And that is the woman, that is the Muslim woman, that is the Hindu woman, that is the Black person in America. I do think that there is a larger issue with Muslim countries. So for example, when you look at Iran, just to go off topic for a second, when the Iranian Revolution came and you have the imposition of you know, headscarf inside Iran, whereby before 1979, it was a choice. And after 1979, it was forced by the government. You do see that the government of Iran was not able to protect the human rights and the civil rights of women. They should be allowed to maintain that choice. And so again, this is in the context of having a fully religious identity of a government. And when you identify that way, then choices, individual choices, are always thrown by the wayside. And so we need to start looking again at how to form national identities that are not based on religion, that are not based on ethnicity, that are based on, you know, the Indian Constitution is a beautiful thing. People should read it. It's really nice. It set out rights. It's very nice. But the problem is in how these things are implemented, you know? So I think that we need to look at implementing a constitution that that preserves the rights of individuals, legal rights, and not preserving rights of, sort of religious and ethnic people. Just say, we are people, we are all humans, and everyone is going to be protected under this law.
Let's move to the next question. The Black Lives Matter protest not only questioned the brutality committed by the police officers, but also again opened up a debate on racial discrimination against Afro-American community, which questions the democratic credentials of United States. Ensuring accountability and transparency is one of the major reform demanded. So according to you, what are other reforms that are required to keep democracy healthy? Like, for example, there are question of a facial recognition tool, but they themselves are not taken as a good example. So what are other kind of reform that you think is required for healthy democracy around the world?
Okay, so accountability and transparency, and what other forms are required? Facial recognition. Yes, okay. Well, I do think that, the questioner has listed a lot of the things that we want, of course, accountability and transparency and so forth. But I do think that the type of reforms we want to make sure that democracy is working healthily. Yes, facial recognition has its own problems as well, that they can be biased. But I'm thinking more in terms of more fundamental reforms. I do think that education is the key. And I don't mean that everyone needs to go to college. In the US, it is very possible that you could become a plumber or an electrician and make very good money, better than someone who gets a bachelor's degree in social science, for example. Now, having said that, in the US, education is very much blocked off. University education is extremely expensive. Many people take student loans and are unable to get out of this. Now, I do think that equal access to education at the elementary and high school level, and then even beyond, is something that we need to think of in terms of democratic reforms to make sure that everyone has equal access to a better life in society. That is something that the US has not done well. We do not support education at the federal level unless you're talking about universities. The elementary and high school level education in the US is very much locally funded by taxes and so forth. And that means that if you are from a poor city, if you're from a highly densely populated city like Detroit, then yours are not going to be well funded because you don't have a good enough tax base. Whereas other people will be in a better tax base, suburban, that's quite wealthy, and then you have beautiful schools. It's wonderful. Now, the problem is that this is systemic, because as long as Black people and other poor people are living in poor areas, well, they're never going to get a better school, and they're never going to get out unless they're just brilliantly studying by themselves and not really working through their own system. So I do think that we need to look at a lot of different policies, not just, police reform is critical, especially right now, right off the bat. This is one of the first demands, police reform, police brutality. But then we need to think further. You need to think the next step. You cannot stop there. You need to say, okay, well, but wait, how do you create wealth? How do you create upward mobility for a whole community so that there is true democracy in a country? So that means finding ways of improving schools, better integrating schools. That helps make them better, actually. And for example, making sure that people have access to housing. Homelessness problem in America is ridiculous. It's growing. We should not, in such a rich country, we should not be having people living in tents in cities. Thousands and thousands of people living homeless. It's not appropriate, whether you're white or Black or brown or whatever. So we need to think of this as a society. What does democracy mean? What does civil rights mean? What do human rights mean? Should we all have access to health, and how? So I think that if we are able to manage to get healthcare and education to our population, we've done a really good job. And that's far from us right now.
There's a very interesting question. Like, how much can we say that the policeman actually was brutal to George Floyd, thinking he's black? It is very possible that he could have behaved in similar manner with white person as well, and he could have died, but the movement would not have taken the way it took. So, what is your comment on this?
I see, yes, but that wouldn't have led to a movement. It would have been just a person's death. Okay, yes, no, this is a good point. Yes, yeah, technically that policeman was, I'm sure, a very unethical, terrible person, honestly, and yeah, he could have killed a white person, true. Now, having said that, what we do know is that more Black people are killed unnecessarily by police than white people. And it's just that until recently, it was not caught on people's phones. Technology has been a huge boon for human rights because it was caught on camera. And so, whereas in the past, what would happen, and this happened many, many times, that Black people would get killed by police, and it would be noted in the police reports as, well, the policeman was responding in self-defense. This Black person was trying to kill me, and I was simply defending myself, and I killed him. Couldn't be helped. So this is the type of narrative that has been built over and over again. However, because of technology, because of cell phones, because we are now catching these things on film, people can see, oh, no, that wasn't the truth. You know, the truth was that this person was killed, and this is happening way too often to Black people. We know that overall, a black man is much more likely to be pulled over for no reason in his car. We have instances all the time in the US of Black people being, you know, police being called on them for doing anything, you know, having a barbecue, sleeping on a bench, you know, or whatever. So it's yes, bad things happen to white people. I am not going to say they don't. Bad things happen to all people. However, having said that, they happen disproportionately to Black people, and Black people in America have already been treated so badly for so long, and people have rewritten history in their own minds in ways to not even see that. So they, you know, many white people think, well, you know, well, how bad can it be? You know, well, you know, just pick yourself up. Well, this is not so easy. A community that has so little wealth compared to white people, it's very different. If someone picks up a Black person and puts him in prison, he may not have the bail to get out. He doesn't have the funds for someone to get him out. He just sit there in prison. White person comes along and says, oh, I'm in prison, mom, dad, you know, send some money, get me out of here. I don't want to sleep one night in this place, right? Even though I was drunk driving. So there is definitely, there are definitely inequalities in the way that the justice system is dealing with Black and white people. And so, yes, it is possible that he could have behaved similarly with a white person. But I do think that the movement was justified because there is no attention that was going on to this in any real way.
There's another question, like Floyd incident along with others represent the impunity with which the police have. Can you highlight some of the reform which has been taken in United States and what more can be done to address this issue?
Impunity that the police have, okay. Okay, well, you know, it's interesting because the police, again, are, except for the National Guard, you know, generally speaking, the police in every state are managed by that state. And so the US is very much like having a whole bunch of different countries stuck together and trying to say that we actually have a policy, which we don't. So different cities take it differently. And we do see that various cities have taken great moves forward. So we do see the example of Camden, New Jersey, that changed the relationship of the police with the community by reducing the role of police in responding to mental health or alcohol or, you know, some drug-related calls and things like that, and allowed mental health services or community services and so forth to respond instead. And they have found that to be very, very helpful. We also see that, let's see. Yeah, there are different cities in the US that have implemented programs to do training, anti-bias training for police. You have, and I do think that now that these protests have happened and really shined a light on these abuses, we are seeing a lot of police departments around the US either marching together, kneeling together with protesters, showing their support and saying, hey, we want to be solid members of the community. So I do think that there are some reforms that are happening, but again, these are always going to be at the city level. Even the federal government actually cannot, they can sort of give direction by, for example, when Trump said to the governors, okay, you really need to crack down as hard as you can. That wasn't a good move. Obviously, the president should give a direction, and if he's visionary, he can give a very good vision and a very good direction. So the federal government, we would hope, would be able to say, okay, we would like, the mayors, the police forces and so forth to do such and such. But in actuality, these localities need to make these changes themselves. And I think that they are starting to happen. I do think that it's going to take a little bit of time. You cannot just take a police department and, you can dismantle it immediately, but then now you have no police. And we do know that there are criminals still. It's not that there are no criminals in the US all of a sudden. So there are fundamental problems that need to be fixed.
How is the situation different for immigrants? Like, is the situation same for immigrants in the US, or it is different from the Black? Like, for example, what is the situation of Asians or Mexicans in the United States compared to Black? If it is different, how is it different?
It's a very good question. There are similarities and there are differences. So let's start off with the Mexican Americans. Now, there are a lot more similarities on that end. That's because we're talking about a large population who are often used in lower skilled labor. We have a lot of farm help from across the border that goes back and forth. We have a lot of people working, like I said, in the meat processing plants and so forth, who are from Latino communities. So they are often facing the same problems that the Black community faces. In addition to that, a lot of our Mexican and Latin people in the country have an additional problem that the government often thinks that they're illegal, even if they're not. So they have this problem, whereas the Blacks have a problem where the government often thinks that they're a criminal when they're not. The Mexicans have the problem that the government thinks that they're illegal when they're not, and wants to come along and grab a whole bunch of them and deport them and whatnot. So that is a extra problem that you're seeing faced by both of those communities. Then you also have immigrants from a variety of other countries. Now, I would say that there is a difference between, now when I talk about the rest of the immigrants, I'm going to say that you have a difference between low-skilled immigrants or refugees who come here with very little skills, and then they are going to end up in those same low-paid jobs with low protections as Blacks and Mexicans, and you'll find a lot of commonalities in what they're facing today. Now, when you look at people like South Asian immigrants and East Asian and other European immigrants and so forth, but even let's just stick to the brown ones for now. So the South Asians and the East Asians and so forth. The difference is that the vast majority of them have come here from an elite background, either upper caste or someone who already had education or who saved up money or something. So it would be false to say, for example, that we, so myself, I'm originally Indian American, my parents came from India. It would be false to say that I have the same challenges as the next Black person. Why? Because both of my parents had graduate level education. So that means that is automatically an advantage that I and many other immigrants would have coming to this country, even if you're not carrying a lot of money with you. Simply having education, simply having confidence. If your community, if your family has told you over and over again that you are a winner, that you are going to succeed, that, our family history has winners, we succeed. And you know what? Our whole community succeeds. We are a successful community. This actually gives a completely different context to that immigrant community and provides it with an extra aura, you know. So I do think that there are significant differences inside immigrant communities and minority groups that we need to think about, and people need to be aware of their own advantages and use those advantages to help others, you know. I think it would be wrong to say that with the advantages that we have, that we don't say, okay, I'm going to give you a hand and help you come up too.
There's one very interesting question. Like, does economic status change the nature of discrimination for Blacks or any other immigrants, you can say, or Asians or others?
Does economic status?
Like, are rich Black discriminated less compared to poor Blacks?
Ah, yes, got it. Yes, very, very good. Yes, absolutely. I'm sure that, you know, I mean, Oprah Winfrey doesn't get discriminated as much as a poor Black person. But having said that, it's not always obvious who's rich and who's not, especially in America. In some other countries, you know, by looking at someone, it can be quite obvious if you're rich or poor. In the US, it's not always so obvious. So if a rich person isn't walking around looking very flauntingly rich, I do think that a Black person would face a lot of the same discrimination. I do know from a lot of my friends and research that, you know, there are grades. There's a whole gradation, right? So you have Black people who have no money and very little education. And in the US, their speech is a signifier, okay? So when they speak, people can tell from their accent and the way that they're speaking that, oh, this is probably a Black person that doesn't have as much education. Then you have Black people who would be considered more white. And I'm not talking about their skin color. I'm talking about the fact that they may have learned in more white schools, so they speak more white. And white people actually perceive them differently. They'll say, oh, okay, well, this is a more white Black person, right? And then you have a very, very much more light-skinned. I mean, when you look at President Obama, he is a Black person. He's actually half white, frankly. But anyways, he's a Black person who spoke very well. His wife also. He and she both speak very well, and they are quite well off. Now, having said that, when you see the amount of vitriol and hate speech and animosity towards him, both during his presidency and afterwards. This is one of the reasons given for the rise of President Trump, that a Black man was elected president of the United States. So you can see that there's this underlying level of racism inside of US society that absolutely needs to be rooted out. We cannot allow this. And I do think that, yeah, you can become rich and as a Black person, and you will get treated better because Americans, like other people in the world, do respect money. But having said that, there are many people in the US who don't care. They just say, you know what, you're Black, you know, and this is the problem. That's the problem. Mm-hmm.
We are coming towards the end of the program. We have last two questions. Like, would Floyd protest would have triggered in the same manner if election in the United States were not at hand? Don't you think that anti-Trump or anti-Republican wanted to use this opportunity to harm Trump's candidacy?
Sorry, so would the protest have happened if there was not an election?
Yeah, if there was no election in November, if it had happened like after the election, would it have triggered in the same manner, the way it happened? Don't you think that there is a role of anti-Trump people or anti-Republican who wanted to use this opportunity to harm Trump's candidacy for the next term?
Interesting. Actually, no, I don't think so. I mean, there could be a few, but no, I really don't think so. I think that the timing was much more related to COVID. We have had so many murders of Black people by police in the last, whatever, decades and forever. But we've been seeing it for many years, and changes just have not been happening. Now, I think two major things were different this time around. One was coronavirus. Everyone was at home. People had the time to watch. People had the time to see, to think, to discuss. A lot of people in normal times, a murder happens, everyone's mad, but oh, I've got to go to work. Oh, can't deal with this right now. I have my own life to deal with. But I do think that the fact that we were all at home quarantined made a big difference. I don't think it was really the election. I think that, I do think that it happens that the people that are against this type of brutality are also against President Trump, because President Trump doesn't really have a problem with brutality. He supports police and government brutality. So I do think yes, it's the same group of people, but I don't think the timing is related to the election.
The last question is again connected with coronavirus that you mentioned. What is the situation of Chinese in the United States post-COVID-19, as there are news of some of them not given accommodation or being attacked, harassed, or things like that?
What is the situation of Chinese in the US? It's a good question, and I'm not very clear right now. I do know that there have been many incidences since COVID where people were racist against Chinese, saying that, Chinese people have the coronavirus and wanting them to be separated out or discriminated in some way. However, right now, the US is largely reopening, and we're seeing basically people doing a lot of normal things. So I'm not sure that they're getting as much of that right now, especially since, honestly, the US is doing much worse with coronavirus than China is by a long shot now. But I do think that, yes, there was a very, very sad and unfortunate set of racist incidences and thoughts against Chinese at the beginning of this. And again, President Trump had influence on this. He called it the Wuhan virus. He called it a Chinese virus. He kept hammering on that. A virus does not have ethnicity. It's a virus, and all the countries were hit. So it's just silly.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lal. Thank you for your enlightening presentation and discussion. We learned a lot, and these topics are not discussed much here in South Asia. So thank you very much for your valuable time. Hope to see you in real sometime very soon. I would also like to thank all our participants for their presence and wonderful question. Thank you very much. Have a nice day to Dr. Lal, and good night to all our participants in South Asia.
Thank you all. This was really great. I love the question.